Glad you could join me today. One of the questions that I think we tend to ask, so what's the point? What's the point of what we're doing? Putting the time in, doing the reading, listening to the messages, what's the point? Paul in 1 Corinthians 10:11, he writes, "These things happened to them and were written down as a warning for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come." What is Paul talking about? He's referring to the stories and the material in the Old Testament, particularly you might say the negative stories, that is, the stories that don't end well. And as we've been traveling through the narrative of Genesis, we certainly have seen some things that haven't ended well. And we want to understand, Paul wants us to understand that this just isn't history, but it's been written to inform us of not only what has happened, but as a direction on how to live, including warnings about the consequences of various behaviors. And if you read that text, you'll see he gives some graphic examples. And there are probably other stories that as we were reading through Genesis that struck you as, whoa, this or that. And one of the things that they only touch on, in fact, how it impacts the men, was the stories of Abraham and Isaac who lied because they were fearful that when they went to live in the Philistine area, they were planning to pass off their wives as their sisters because they were afraid that they would have their lives taken. And then their wives taken. It's their lives taken and then their wives taken. And so they lied and said, hey, she's my sister. And of course, that's eventually found out, and the Philistine people aren't pleased. And one of the things I thought, what a predicament that put their wives in. Not a good way to go about things. That in the face of their fear, it would have taken great courage and faith to stay the line, to be truthful. And Paul goes on to issue a warning in verse 12. He says, so if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. All right? Be careful. That don't ever think that these kinds of things can never happen to you, that in a case of fear, that you may fudge the truth. That when it is to your benefit, that you might fudge the truth. He's calling us to be self-aware. What are our thinking tendencies? Are we open? What happens when we get negative feedback? When we get warnings from people in one way or another? Do we get angry? Do we shut people down? Do we shut ourselves down? Do we avoid the topic? How do we respond when people don't respond very well to us? How do we interact with that? And we get some, I guess, some examples throughout Genesis on some of those things. But what we know is that Paul says, be careful. That these lessons that we've been reading about, these stories, they're lessons for us, warnings for us, examples to learn from. And so with this in mind, I've encouraged you to do the readings, to listen for God's voice as you read, as you listen. And it's not just about remembering, right? Intellectually getting the story correct, although that's a great thing. But it's also reflecting, going, what does that mean for me? What's the warning here, or what's the guidance? What's the principle? And then integrating it into your life. And I'd encourage you just to think about that for a moment. What have you been learning? What have you been learning? Are there any questions that come up? And I want to say that certainly in the comments, if you have a question that you want answered, please drop that. If you have some feedback one way or the other, positive or, hey, do this or don't do this, certainly take your time to drop me a comment so I can know better what's helpful or what's not helpful, and improve this for you. Now, last week, we ended at Genesis, the end of chapter 45. And so we're beginning with 46 today. And what we're starting off with, of course, is now that Jacob, he has heard about Joseph, the invitation. And so he's getting his family, his belongings, right, the livestock, all gathered together to begin the journey to Egypt. And so they set out, and they get as far as a place called Beersheba. And he offers sacrifices to God, which says the God of his father Isaac. And what's the significance of Beersheba? Why does he stop there? Well, if you recall, this is where actually Abraham interacts with the Philistines, and they make this observation, and it's interesting, they come to him. While he's the foreigner, they come to him, and they want to make a peace treaty. And they observe, and they said, God is with you in everything you do. And so they're watching, and they're going, man, he's blessed by God. And so they want this peace treaty. And then there was an issue about a well, right? And so they worked that through. And of course, in both of these events, right, peace and water for survival. Peace is necessary for survival. So two very important things. And we're told that Abraham plants a tree at that area. He calls on the name of the Lord, the eternal God, and he stays in the land of the Philistines for a long time. Then we go forward to another generation, to Isaac, who has a very similar incident with the Philistines in this area. And again, they wanted to have a peace treaty. And again, there is, in this case, that peace treaty is done, and he digs a well. Because what do we need? Water. Peace and water are two critical things in their survival. And he called the well Sheba, and to this day, the name of the town has been Beersheba, we read. And it's in this area, right, that Isaac's sons Jacob and Esau grow up. And this is the area that Jacob leaves when he's done the dirty deed, if you will, in terms of taking Esau's blessing, and then they send him out to seek a wife. Well, he's leaving this area. And now what do we have? He's coming back after so many years, right? God has promised to take care of them. And that God is going to be true to his promise. And so and true to his promise to provide and protect. And so after many years, he's coming back. And he follows the practice, right, of his grandfather and his father, calling on the name of the Lord. He comes to this place. He recognizes the spiritual significance, and he prays and he acknowledges the living God. And in response, what we hear is that in verse 2, and God spoke to Israel, that is Jacob, in a vision at night. And he said, Jacob, Jacob. And Jacob goes, well, here I am. And in verse 3, I am God. God says, I am God, the God of your father. He says, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. And here's the foreshadowing. This is going to tell us something big about what the future is going to look like. He says, I will go down to Egypt. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. So the promise is still on, right? That he'll make him into a great nation. But it's going to be in Egypt where that's going to happen. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. The son you haven't seen for decades will be at your bedside when you pass. Now, I don't know if you're a first-generation Jesus follower or if you had the benefit of parents who introduced you to Jesus. That we see Jacob benefiting from the faith of his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham, and he gets to be a part of the promise and a part of the blessing that God had made also to his father and grandfather. And so what we have is all of the family get up. They gather out and they continue on. There's, I believe, about 67 males and their families. I'd say a long way from a nation. A large family reunion we might agree on, but in terms of a nation, hardly. And of course, the famine's on the land, and they're really in danger of ceasing to exist in the coming years. And so they set out for Egypt. They arrived in Egypt, and as promised, they got the land of Goshen, the sort of the best land in the country, and it's it's away from the Egyptians. And the idea partially is what we have here is the Egyptians didn't care for herders, sheep, shepherds, and so on. They disliked that type of thing. So God used the racial, ethnic, you might say social biases of the Egyptians as a way of preserving the ethnic and spiritual identity of his people. And so they're not all intermarrying like they were starting to do with the Canaanites. It sort of pulls them out of that and allows them again to focus in on their own people, keeping their own identity and not losing their faith as well, as sometimes happens when we venture in. It's like one of those reasons that we're called to, to marry people of the faith. Now, of course, the famine continues, and both Egypt and Canaan are wasting away, and Joseph continues at his job for Egypt, and Egypt's being saved, and other people groups to some degree as well, and with their connection and when they come to buy food. And of course, what happens is that just as they had run out of their own food and started to buy food from Joseph, from his storehouses, soon they run out of money. And so then he says, well, sell me the livestock. And so he started taking livestock for food. And then after a while, they ran out of livestock. And so the Egyptians were coming and saying, listen, take our land. What good is our land if we die? And we'll be your slaves. Why slaves? What's that advantage? Well, the way I understand it, that would be the owner's responsibility to feed them. And so they're throwing themselves at the mercy of Pharaoh in some ways. You can take our land, we'll be your servants, we'll work for you, right? Just feed us. And so that goes on. And then it sort of comes to a culmination at the end where things are going to turn around. And Joseph says to them, to these Egyptians that have made this movie, says, and sort of I think that was a pretty wide practice there, except for the priests who the Pharaoh had always provided for. They got to keep their land and he fed them. That was part of their, you might say, their salary package for doing their priestly duties. Well, the deal that Joseph presents to them is he says, okay, you guys, I'll give you the seed to plant the land. You guys go out and you just look after it basically like it's yours. And what you need to do is you get to keep 80% of what you grow and you give Pharaoh 20%. Sort of like you might say our income taxes of today. It was a 20% flat rate. In Canada, our HST is 13%, never mind the income tax that sort of gradually moves up depending on how much you make. And so really a much lower rate than what we pay today. And so what we're told is we sort of focus in on Jacob for a little bit. He lives in the land for he gets another 17 years of life, this time in Egypt. But his life is coming to an end, even as the book is coming to an end. And he takes the time to bless Joseph and say, basically what he does is he takes Joseph's blessing and he divides it between his two sons. He says, I'm taking your sons as my own and I'm giving them the inheritance, both of them, like they're my own sons. And he blesses all of his other sons. And what's interesting is they don't all get the same thing. They all get a blessing, but what that looks like differs. And one of the things why we see it differs, so I'm not saying this is everything, but one of the things had to do with their prior behavior. And to some degree, I guess that would be attached to their character. And so the other thing that Jacob says is, listen, when I die, swear to me, promise to me that you won't bury me here. You'll take me back to where my grandfather and my father are buried, right in that cave that Abraham bought in that field. Bring me back and bury me there. Promise me that. And his sons promised him that. And so he dies at 147 years of age. And we're told that they had their part of their grieving practices, right? It's not like our days where, you have a few days, you have the funeral and everything, and then it sort of seems like it's over, except for anyone who's grieved and felt the loss of a loved one. You know that 3 days or a week just doesn't cut it. And the sense of loss and pain continue much longer. Well, what we read about is that because of Jacob's, as far as I can tell, because of Jacob's connection to Joseph, basically all of Egypt, the Egyptians mourn. There's a period of 70 days. So it's not just the Jacob's family that's mourning, there's this recognition of Jacob in his life and that he's gone, that he's passed on, and this for 70 days. And then they gather together, all of the family except the kids, head to go back, right, back out of Egypt, back to where they had come from, back more specifically right to that piece of land. And we also read that Pharaoh's officials go too. So it's a big company, right? There's a lot of people going. And so they go, and when they arrive, Joseph announces, you might say, or proclaims another 7 days of mourning. And so once that's passed, they have the appropriate burial for him, and then they come back. All of them come back to Egypt. Now, when Joseph's brothers see that their father is dead, they once again become fearful to think, oh, now we're in for it. And so they seek his forgiveness and mercy and even offer themselves as his slaves. And Joseph's response is that his heart is touched. And he says, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. Okay, he acknowledged this. He doesn't whitewash it, but he says, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. Genesis 50, 19-21. And I thought, what an example. We're talking about examples. What an example to us who've been wronged by others. How do we respond? And we know that there's just decades, right? Some very difficult years for Joseph. But he's embraced this, and he's seen the bigger picture, and he recognizes that God has brought good out of this bad situation. And I thought, what an example to those of us who've been wronged by others, and especially when we're thinking of those who have been willing to acknowledge their wrongdoing. Are we kind? Are we forgiving? Are we moving on? Or are we hanging on to that and use it as leverage against that person? Well, our chapter and the book of Genesis closes with Joseph, along with his father's family, living in Egypt. Joseph gets to see his son's children, and in the case of Ephraim, his children's children. He had the same concern as Jacob. Don't leave my remains here, but to bring his bones back to the land from which they had come. And has his family promised to do that very thing. And he promises and reassures them. He says, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So at some point, God will come to your aid. That God will keep his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and will bring you back. And so here we have the second youngest seemingly dying first at the age of 110 years old. Much younger than his father and grandfather and great-grandfather. And then Genesis ends. Our journey, our narrative ends with this verse. That is verse 26. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And so that ends. This is where Genesis ends, sort of setting us up for what we will learn later in Exodus. And again, as I say, so what we have learned, of course, is in the first 11 chapters, creation, fall of humankind, the flood, and the creation or the division of nations. And then, of course, we talked about geographical features of the land and how and 4 generations, right? Abraham, who has 2 sons, it's talked about, Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac has twins that we learn about, Esau and Jacob. And of course, Jacob has these 12 sons and a daughter that's in this story. And of course, the story focuses largely on Joseph. And we hear of 2 sons particularly that he has, Manasseh and Ephraim. And I hope that there has been some stories that have captured your attention, and that either as a warning or as an emotional tug, maybe opening something up, or just as or maybe something about recognizing how God is faithful, although sometimes in the moment it looks like he's gone. He ceases to exist. It seems like he's invisible sometimes, and yet reflecting back, we can clearly see that God is true to his promises, providing and protecting. That he really has this heart to bless us and to call us into his presence and to serve him. And so we'll end Genesis here and go on, take some time for Palm Sunday, and Easter Sunday, those will be separate from this, and may even actually precede this message when it's posted. But thanks for staying with me, and it'll be neat to see what we learn from Exodus. God bless you.